China is a key partner of African nations in terms of trade and investments. But Beijing is now expanding this partnership into the defense sector as well. Now, this trend is clearly visible in the Sahel region, where Chinese weapons and artillery have been making their way. In the latest, Burkina Faso's armed forces have received a fresh consignment of Chinese-manufactured armored vehicles and artillery pieces.
Burkina Faso has just received a massive shipment of advanced Chinese weapons, armored vehicles, rocket launchers, and heavy artillery now lined up on its soil. A nation once reliant on France and the US has turned east, and the battlefield in the Sahel may never look the same again. But why did this happen now? And what does it mean for Burkina Faso's war and Africa's future? Let's find that out. The quiet streets of Ouagadougou were disrupted in August 2025 by the roar of engines, the grind of metal, and the sudden appearance of something rarely seen in West Africa. Brand new Chinese armored vehicles, artillery systems, and rocket launchers rolling into military bases under heavy guard. It wasn't rumor, speculation, or propaganda. Video footage verified by defense analysts quickly showed endless rows of VN-22B fire support vehicles, PLL-05 self-propelled gun mortars, and SR-5 multiple rocket launchers, all painted in desert and jungle camouflage. Soldiers stood proudly beside them, while engineers prepared the machines for deployment. For Burkina Faso, this was more than a delivery. It was the visible proof of a pivot away from the West and a leap into a new military era. The centerpiece of the shipment was the VN-22B, a six-wheeled armored platform designed to survive direct hits from armor-piercing rounds while unleashing its stabilized 30mm autocannon on fast-moving targets. Its advanced fire control system allows soldiers to lock on with precision, even while in motion, a feature that instantly transforms how Burkinabe forces can respond to ambushes on rough Sahel terrain. Watching these machines roll past must have been a surreal moment for a country that, until recently, relied heavily on pickup trucks and second-hand carriers for frontline operations. But the delivery wasn't just about armored fire support. Lined up beside the VN-22Bs were the PLL-05 120mm gun mortars, hybrid systems mounted on armored chassis that can operate as both mortars and cannons. In practice, this means that commanders can shell insurgent hideouts from a distance, then shift seamlessly to direct fire if militants close in. For soldiers long accustomed to either outdated mortars or exposed artillery crews, the PLL-05 represents a level of battlefield flexibility they have never known. Perhaps the most eye-catching of all were the SR-5 multiple rocket launch systems, each with modular pods capable of launching guided and unguided munitions out to 70 kilometers. These systems give Burkina Faso, for the first time, a credible long-range strike option. Militants who once found safety in remote bases now face the prospect of precision-guided rockets raining down from afar. The psychological impact alone, knowing that insurgent sanctuaries are no longer untouchable, could be as significant as the physical firepower. This delivery was not an isolated gesture. Prior shipments over the past year had already included Norinco CS/VP 14 mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles, CS/VN9 armored personnel carriers, and Shackman heavy logistics trucks, building the logistical backbone needed to support modern combat operations. But the August 2025 package stands out for its scale, sophistication, and visibility. Unlike earlier deliveries that slipped in with little fanfare, this one was displayed openly, even proudly, signaling to both domestic audiences and foreign observers that Burkina Faso is no longer fighting with scraps. It is rearming with state-of-the-art tools. The timing is equally significant. Western military aid has been shrinking, leaving Ouagadougou increasingly isolated. France has withdrawn, the United States has scaled down its footprint, and international promises of support have repeatedly failed to translate into weapons on the ground. Into that vacuum stepped China, not with rhetoric, but with convoys of steel. This delivery was a statement. Where the West retreats, Beijing advances. Still, one cannot overlook the risks. Modern systems are only as effective as the troops trained to use them. Integrating autocannons, hybrid mortars, and modular rocket systems requires new doctrines, extensive drills, and logistical discipline. If mishandled, These assets could become symbolic trophies rather than practical game changers. Yet judging from the scale and pace of Chinese deliveries, Beijing seems intent not just on supplying weapons, but on embedding training and support into the package, ensuring the systems don't sit idle. For Burkina Faso, the arrival of this arsenal is nothing short of a watershed moment. The army, once written off as under-equipped and overstretched, now holds capabilities that rival or surpass many of its neighbors. Insurgents accustomed to raiding vulnerable convoys may soon face armored columns equipped with rapid-fire autocannons and long-range rockets. The question, however, is whether firepower alone is enough to alter the trajectory of the conflict. And so we must ask, why exactly was Burkina Faso so desperate for such a transformation? And how do these weapons address the realities of its war on the ground? To understand why the August 2025 weapons delivery was so urgent, one must step into the harsh reality Burkina Faso has lived through over the past decade. Since 2015, insurgencies have turned vast swaths of the country into war zones. Villages in the north and east were torched, government outposts overrun, and entire communities forced to abandon their homes. By 2024, nearly 2 million Burkinabe had been displaced, making the nation one of the epicenters of Africa's humanitarian crisis. The army, overstretched and under-equipped, was often powerless to respond. Militants arrived on motorbikes or pickups, striking villages and convoys with speed and vanishing into the bush before security forces could react. Old Kalashnikovs, a few aging armored carriers, and scattered artillery pieces stood no chance against insurgents who adapted their tactics constantly. Every time the state seemed to regain ground, the militants reshaped the battlefield, forcing soldiers into a cycle of reaction rather than initiative. This is why the new systems delivered in August were seen as more than tools. They were lifelines. Each weapon directly addressed a specific weakness that had haunted the army for years. The VN-22B fire support vehicles, for example, gave soldiers the ability to respond instantly to ambushes. Instead of convoys being easy prey on open roads, these armored platforms allow troops to push forward under protection while retaliating with heavy autocannon fire accurate enough to pick off moving targets at speed. In a conflict where most attacks occur in transit, this kind of mobility and survivability can mean the difference between disaster and dominance. The PLL-05 gun mortars answered a different problem: flexibility. In the countryside, insurgents hide in forest patches or mud compounds, making them difficult to dislodge with small arms fire. Traditional mortars could shell such positions, but they left crews exposed and were too slow to adapt when militants closed in. With the PLL-05, commanders can bombard enemy hideouts from a safe distance and then, without switching platforms, engage directly if the battle shifts to close quarters. For the first time, Burkinabe units can dictate the tempo instead of constantly being forced to adjust. Then, there are the SR-5 rocket systems, which may prove the most decisive of all. Insurgents have long exploited the vastness of Burkina Faso's rural terrain, retreating deep into ungoverned spaces where the army had no reach. With rockets capable of striking up to 70 kilometers, those sanctuaries are no longer untouchable. Guided munitions, in particular, allow the army to launch precision strikes on known camps, training grounds, or supply caches. This changes not only the military calculus, but also the psychological one. Insurgent groups can no longer assume they are safe simply because they operate beyond immediate patrol routes. The urgency of acquiring such systems was also tied to morale. For years, Burkinabe soldiers fought with the sense that they were being sent into impossible battles with inferior tools. That sense of futility eroded cohesion and, at times, discipline. The arrival of advanced weaponry does more than increase firepower. It restores confidence. It tells the rank-and-file soldier that his government is investing in his survival and the possibility of victory. In conflicts like these, where insurgents thrive on demoralization as much as firepower, that psychological shift could prove invaluable. And yet, if weapons answer the immediate tactical challenges, they also raise another question. Why was it China, and not the traditional Western partners, that stepped in to deliver them? France once dominated the security architecture of the Sahel, and the US poured billions into counterinsurgency across Africa. So how did Ouagadougou end up turning eastward for its salvation? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. For decades, Burkina Faso's security story was written in Paris. The country was once seen as a loyal outpost of France's military presence in the Sahel, dependent on French advisors, trainers, and firepower to confront insurgent threats. But that dependency came at a cost. Paris often dictated the terms, tying aid and military presence to political loyalty, economic concessions, and an acceptance of France's overarching role in the region. As insurgencies spread and French forces failed to deliver lasting stability, resentment boiled over. By 2022, mass protests filled Ouagadougou's streets, calling for the end of French influence. Eventually, French troops were expelled, and with them went the security guarantees that had once anchored Burkina Faso's defense posture. The United States might have been expected to fill the void, but Washington's approach was more cautious. While it funneled intelligence and occasional support, its involvement in the Sahel was increasingly driven by counterinsurgency priorities rather than the existential needs of the local states themselves. Burkinabe leaders complained that U.S. assistance came with heavy conditions, emphasis on governance reforms, oversight mechanisms, and restrictions on how aid could be used. For a government facing daily insurgent attacks, such delays and caveats felt like a luxury it could not afford. This is where China emerged as an alternative. Unlike the West, Beijing does not attach political strings to its arms deals. It does not demand reforms or tie deliveries to election timetables. Instead, it offers speed, volume, and financial flexibility. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government, which has defined itself on sovereignty and independence, that approach was far more appealing. Where the West spoke of democracy and accountability, China simply delivered weapons. But it wasn't just about convenience, it was about symbolism. By turning to Beijing, Ouagadougou made a deliberate statement. Burkina Faso was no longer willing to be a client state of the West. It was asserting its right to choose partners based on interest rather than colonial ties. This symbolic dimension is reinforced by the very visibility of the Chinese convoys. Unlike Western weapons, often supplied quietly and in small quantities, the August 2025 shipment was rolled out openly, photographed and broadcast across the region. It was meant to be seen, not just as an arms transfer, but as a flag planted in the shifting geopolitical sands of the Sahel. The timing also reflects a broader regional trend. Mali and Niger, both grappling with similar insurgencies, have also pivoted away from France, with Mali openly embracing Russian military contractors and Niger exploring Turkish and Chinese options. The three nations now form a bloc that increasingly defines itself as post-Western. By equipping Burkina Faso with modern systems, Beijing positions itself at the center of this realignment, using arms as the currency of influence. For China, the deal goes far beyond Burkina Faso itself. It is part of a long-term strategy to deepen ties with Africa, not just through trade and infrastructure, but through defense and security. Arms sales open doors to training programs, maintenance contracts, and long-lasting military partnerships. In effect, they bind African armies to Chinese supply chains, ensuring dependency not on Paris or Washington, but on Beijing. Every rocket launcher and armored vehicle delivered is also a relationship forged, one that shifts the balance of influence away from the West. Burkina Faso's decision, then, was not just about survival on the battlefield. It was about sovereignty, about aligning with partners who respect its choices rather than dictate them. Yet, this raises another practical question. How is a country with one of the lowest GDPs per capita in the world paying for such sophisticated systems? The answer lies not in ideology, but in the creative financial and political arrangements that underpin the deal. A story that reveals just how far both sides are willing to go to secure their interests. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Burkina Faso's economy is fragile. With one of the lowest GDPs per capita globally, high unemployment, and vast portions of its population displaced by conflict, The image of convoys of freshly imported Chinese armored vehicles rolling into military bases raises a glaring question. How can a country in such economic distress afford such an arsenal? The answer lies in the way China structures its deals. Unlike Western suppliers, who often demand cash up front and enforce strict repayment schedules, Beijing has mastered the art of flexible defense financing. For Burkina Faso, this likely includes a combination of deferred payments, concessional loans, and perhaps barter-style arrangements linked to future natural resource revenues. This model allows a state under pressure to secure weapons today while spreading the financial burden into the future. Gold is the most likely backbone of these arrangements. Burkina Faso ranks among Africa's top gold producers, and gold revenues already serve as the country's primary source of foreign exchange. Analysts believe Ouagadougou may have pledged a share of future gold exports as collateral for the arms deal. By tying repayment to resources rather than cash transfers, the government ensures it can acquire immediate firepower without emptying its treasury. This model is not new. China has used similar mechanisms in places like Angola and the Democratic Republic of Congo, where infrastructure and arms projects were secured against oil and mineral revenues. Another possibility is what economists call concessional arms loans, where repayment schedules are stretched over decades, interest rates remain low, and penalties are minimal. For Beijing, this is not charity. It is a strategic investment. By making repayment easy in the short term, China ensures Burkina Faso becomes a long-term partner, bound to Chinese supply chains for spare parts, maintenance, and training. Once an army operates Chinese systems, switching to another supplier becomes both costly and impractical. Still, Burkina Faso is not putting all its eggs in Beijing's basket. Traoré's government has also pursued deals with Turkey for drones, Egypt for armored vehicles, and investments in local production of light armored units. This diversification is deliberate. It prevents dependency while also strengthening Ouagadougou's bargaining power. By showing it has options, Burkina Faso can negotiate better financial terms with each partner. The Chinese deal, therefore, is not an isolated transaction, but part of a broader strategy of supplier competition. Critics argue that such arrangements risk mortgaging Burkina Faso's future, locking the country into long-term repayment schemes that may constrain its sovereignty. But supporters counter that survival today takes precedence over abstract concerns tomorrow. With villages falling, soldiers demoralized, and borders threatened, the immediate cost of inaction is far greater than the deferred cost of loans. For the Burkinabe leadership, the choice is stark: either arm now or risk the collapse of the state. There is also a domestic political angle. By securing modern weapons through flexible financing, Traoré's government bolsters its legitimacy. Citizens see visible proof of rearmament. Soldiers receive upgraded tools, and the regime presents itself as capable of defying Western abandonment. In this sense, the deal is as much about politics as economics. The Burkinabe state cannot afford weakness, and Chinese financing ensures it does not have to project weakness at home or abroad. This financial creativity, however, points us toward the bigger picture. If China can provide advanced arms on credit, secured by resources, and delivered at speed, then Burkina Faso is not just buying weapons. It is buying into a new system of international relations. A system where Beijing, not Paris or Washington, sets the rules of engagement. And so the final question emerges. What does this shift mean for the future of the Sahel and Africa as a whole? Will these deals stabilize the region or simply create new dependencies under a different patron? That is the debate shaping the next chapter of this story. The arrival of Chinese weapons in Burkina Faso is not just about one country's military upgrade, it reverberates across the entire Sahel. For years, this region has been defined by foreign interventions, particularly France's Operation Barkhane and the broader Western-led security architecture. Now that landscape is being dismantled and replaced by something new, unpredictable, and distinctly multipolar. Burkina Faso's deal with China is the clearest sign yet that the Sahel is no longer content to be a Western sphere of influence. The most immediate impact will be on the regional balance of power. Neighboring Mali has leaned heavily on Russian Wagner contractors, while Niger, since its political upheaval, has begun exploring Turkish drones and Chinese partnerships. With Burkina Faso now openly deploying Chinese rocket systems and armored vehicles, a new bloc is taking shape. Sahel states that have rejected Paris and Washington in favor of diversified, non-Western alliances. Together, they represent a collective experiment in sovereignty, testing whether Africa can secure itself without Western tutelage. This raises profound questions for Western capitals. France, once the uncontested security guarantor in the region, finds its credibility in tatters. The United States, though still present through intelligence and drone bases, is seen as cautious and reactive rather than committed. China's entry into the picture exposes a vacuum, the West's inability to deliver fast, decisive support when African states needed it most. By contrast, Beijing has shown it can deliver convoys of modern equipment within months, reshaping battlefield realities almost overnight. That efficiency carries enormous symbolic weight. For insurgents, the implications are equally significant. Groups have long thrived on the perception that state forces were weak and ill-equipped. They use speed, mobility, and rural hideouts to stay one step ahead of national armies. The introduction of long-range rockets, stabilized autocannons, and hybrid mortars threatens to shatter that advantage. Militants can adapt, of course. They may seek new tactics, including dispersal into smaller units or greater reliance on civilian shields. But they will no longer be able to assume that rural sanctuaries are safe from retaliation. The psychological balance of fear may begin to tilt back toward the state. Yet the consequences are not purely military. Burkina Faso's pivot to China represents a broader shift in African agency. For decades, African nations were told that their security depended on Western benevolence. Now, Ouagadougou is demonstrating that alternatives exist. Other governments across the continent will be watching closely. If Chinese arms help Burkina Faso stabilize even part of its territory, the model could spread. Arms sales could then become the foundation for broader cooperation in infrastructure, technology, and governance, deepening China's influence across Africa. At the same time, the shift carries risks. Dependency on a new patron, even one as pragmatic as Beijing, may recreate the very vulnerabilities these nations are trying to escape. If Burkina Faso's repayment mechanisms hinge on gold exports, future economic shocks could give China leverage over its policies. Critics also warn that focusing on heavy weaponry risks, neglecting the underlying political and social drivers of insurgency, poverty, marginalization, and governance failures. Advanced rockets can kill militants, but they cannot rebuild trust between the state and its citizens. Still, for Burkinabe leaders, the calculus is clear. Survival today matters more than hypothetical risks tomorrow. find out. The announcement came without warning, but its impact was thunderous. In Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré stepped before cameras and declared that Burkina Faso would not surrender its gold to the International Monetary Fund, no matter what the so-called debt relief package promised. With one sentence, he upended months of quiet maneuvering by Washington lobbyists, IMF officials, and former U.S. President Donald Trump's financial backers. This wasn't just a technical rejection of a contract, it was the open rejection of a system. For decades, IMF deals had been signed behind closed doors, dressed up as lifelines, only for the fine print to turn them into shackles. But this time, the fine print was dragged into the daylight, and Traoré slammed it shut before the ink could even touch the page. The IMF proposal had been pitched as a chance to stabilize Burkina Faso's economy, unlock international credit, and show investors the country was open for business. Western officials expected a handshake, not a fist. Instead, Traoré accused the deal-makers of staging what he called an economic coup, a bloodless overthrow designed not with tanks, but with contracts that would hand over Burkina Faso's lifeline, nearly $300 million worth of gold reserves. The reaction was immediate. In Washington, anonymous IMF insiders leaked their frustration to the press, insisting Traoré was risking his country's stability. In Paris, French commentators warned that isolation awaited any African leader who dared defy the system. But in Ouagadougou, the mood was the exact opposite. Crowds poured into the streets chanting his name, waving placards that read, "Not our gold and Africa is not for sale." The people understood instinctively that something monumental had happened. What stunned Western observers even more was the speed of the solidarity that followed. In Bamako, Malian officials applauded the move, with state radio declaring that a line has been drawn in the sand. In Niamey, Nigerian leaders hinted they too were reviewing their resource contracts. The news ricocheted across the Sahel, carried by WhatsApp groups, community radios, and Pan-African media outlets that framed it as more than a rejection. It was the first decisive battle in a new kind of war, the war for economic sovereignty. The symbolism was powerful. For years, Africa's wealth had been negotiated in backrooms of Washington, Paris, and London, with African leaders reduced to signatories on documents drafted elsewhere. But Traoré flipped the script. He did not beg for favorable terms, nor did he play for gradual reform. He tore up the script entirely, sending a message not just to the IMF, but to every African leader watching: you don't have to sign. Western capitals struggled to contain the fallout. Analysts on U.S. financial networks tried to downplay the move as reckless populism, but even they admitted the danger. If one small country could refuse, others might follow. And if others followed, the entire model of debt for resources could unravel. Suddenly, the $300 million at stake looked small compared to the billions in gold, uranium, and oil that Western economies still depend on. For the people of Burkina Faso, however, the meaning was simpler. This was about dignity. Ordinary citizens knew their gold wasn't just a number in IMF spreadsheets, it was the backbone of their schools, hospitals, and industries. Losing it would have meant losing control of their future. And so when Traoré said no, he wasn't just rejecting a contract, he was reaffirming the principle that Africa's wealth belongs first to Africans. But what exactly was hidden inside this package that made it so dangerous, so suffocating, that Traoré had to slam the brakes before it was too late? When Ibrahim Traoré called the IMF package an economic coup, he wasn't speaking in metaphors. The scheme was designed with the kind of precision only decades of exploitation could refine. On paper, the offer seemed routine, a debt relief arrangement backed by a digital currency innovation aimed at giving Burkina Faso stability and global market credibility. In practice, it was a handcuff welded in gold. At its core was the collateralization clause. The IMF wanted $300 million worth of gold reserves pledged as security. The moment Burkina Faso stumbled on repayment, even for reasons outside its control, like global price shocks or regional instability, the IMF would have the legal right to seize the gold outright. And not just seize it quietly, but transfer ownership under international law, ensuring there would be no appeal, no reversal, no national sovereignty to fall back on. It was a financial foreclosure waiting to happen. But the seizure clause was only the first layer. Hidden in the contract was the Phoenix Dollar framework, a digital currency experiment pitched as a way to modernize African economies. The sales pitch was slick, a blockchain-backed token, anchored by gold reserves, designed to protect against inflation and attract investors. What they didn't say is that the Phoenix Dollar would be controlled not by Africans, but by Western banks and think tanks who already had their claws in the system. This meant Burkina Faso's reserves wouldn't just be collateral, they would be the foundation of a digital currency it didn't control. In other words, the country's gold would be used to back a foreign-issued currency, while its own citizens remained locked out of the benefits. If implemented, every ounce of gold mined in the future could be tagged to Phoenix Dollar reserves, draining wealth straight into the Western system, while giving Burkina Faso little more than token credits in return. The brilliance and the cruelty of the scheme were how well it was camouflaged. To ordinary observers, it looked like a modernization project, even a step toward digital innovation. To African governments desperate for debt relief, it looked like a lifeline. But for anyone reading the fine print carefully, it was clear. This wasn't about helping Africa integrate into the global economy. It was about binding African economies to Western systems in ways more sophisticated than the old colonial currencies ever managed. And here's the kicker. The Phoenix Dollar wasn't just an economic tool, it was a geopolitical weapon. By anchoring African resources to a digital currency headquartered outside the continent, Washington and its allies would effectively decide the pace of African growth. Need more liquidity? Wait for approval? Want to adjust reserves? Not without consent. Even domestic policies like subsidies or infrastructure spending could be crippled by the way gold reserves were tied up. In other words, sovereignty would exist on paper, but not in practice. Traoré spotted the trap immediately. For a leader who had already overseen the transfer of gold mines to state ownership, signing such a deal would have undone everything. It would have been like handing back the keys to the vault after finally changing the locks. That's why he didn't hesitate to call it out for what it was, an economic coup staged through paperwork instead of soldiers. And let's not forget the bigger picture. This wasn't an isolated experiment aimed only at Burkina Faso. Documents leaked in financial circles suggested the IMF wanted to roll out similar agreements across the Sahel, starting with countries facing the heaviest debt burdens. The goal wasn't just to secure repayment, it was to establish a template. If Burkina Faso signed, Mali, Niger, and even resource-rich states like Nigeria could be pulled into the same net. The Phoenix Dollar would spread like a digital colonial coin, locking Africa into a new system of invisible control. Now the question becomes, why did this scheme appear now at this exact moment? Why is the IMF so desperate to seize Africa's gold and resources with digital chains? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The rejection of the IMF package did not fall from a clear blue sky. It came in the middle of a political wildfire sweeping across the Sahel. Call it what you want: economic independence, sovereignty, or, in the words of its critics, resource nationalism. But to those living it, it feels like liberation. For the first time in generations, leaders are not just talking about Africa's wealth belonging to Africa. They are taking it, mine by mine, well by well. Take Burkina Faso. In 2025, it moved decisively to nationalize 5 major gold mines, placing them under the control of Sopamib, the state-owned mining company. Overnight, foreign corporations that had dominated production for years were told, "Your concessions are over, your profits no longer belong to you." That gold, which makes up a fifth of Burkina Faso's GDP, was redirected toward national budgets instead of foreign stockholders. In a country that had long been portrayed as fragile, this was a thunderclap. But Burkina Faso is not an isolated case. In Mali, the government has been clawing back concessions from multinational operators in gold production. In Niger, uranium, the mineral that keeps France's nuclear lights on, has been the focus. For decades, Niger exported uranium at prices dictated in Paris, only to see villages near the mines left in poverty. Now Niamey is rewriting the rules, demanding higher revenues and more local control. Across the Sahel, leaders are saying the same thing. Africa is done being the world's quarry. What makes this wave different from the nationalist surges of the past is its coordination. These are not scattered policy experiments. They are a regional doctrine taking root under military-led governments that see economic sovereignty as inseparable from political survival. In Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, leaders are aligning not just on security but on economics, treating resources as the backbone of sovereignty rather than bargaining chips in international negotiations. And the people are behind it. In towns that once watched trucks full of gold and uranium disappear toward foreign ports, there's a sense of vindication. Farmers, miners, and traders who once saw no benefit from the wealth beneath their soil now believe the tide may finally be turning. This groundswell of popular support gives leaders like Traoré the confidence to defy the IMF openly. He is not speaking into a void. He is echoing the demands of millions who know too well how little foreign development has developed them. Western powers have labeled this nationalism reckless and unsustainable, claiming it will scare away investment. But this critique misses the point. For Sahel leaders, foreign investment without sovereignty is not a gift. It's a trap. They are willing to trade short-term capital inflows for long-term control, betting that Africa's resources can be managed by Africans for Africans. It's a radical inversion of the old order. And this is precisely why the IMF and its Western backers are panicking. They know that once resource nationalism takes hold, the leverage they've used for decades, cheap access to Africa's gold, uranium, and oil through debt contracts, begins to evaporate. If Burkina Faso can hold its gold, if Niger can price its uranium, if Mali can keep its gold revenues, then the pillars of the old financial system start to crack. But to fully understand why the IMF is fighting so hard to maintain control, we need to step back. This isn't just about one deal or one region. It's about a pattern that stretches back decades, where debt relief and reform have been used as weapons to keep Africa subordinate. The question that now hangs over the continent is simple. How exactly has the IMF managed to keep Africa chained for so long? And what happens now that the chain is breaking? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. For half a century, the IMF's playbook has been painfully consistent. Offer loans to struggling nations, then attach conditions so harsh that repayment becomes nearly impossible. What looks like assistance on the surface has always been a weapon underneath. The first tactic is austerity. African governments that took IMF loans were forced to slash public spending on schools, hospitals, food subsidies, and even basic wages to balance budgets. The language sounded technical, even responsible. In reality, it meant stripping away the very foundations of daily life. Generations of Africans grew up under these cuts, with overcrowded classrooms, understaffed clinics, and entire sectors of society left to collapse. The second tactic was privatization. National assets, from water utilities to airlines, were sold off to foreign corporations under IMF supervision. The logic was that private management would bring efficiency. What it brought instead was dependency. Profits that once supported local development were siphoned abroad, while citizens paid higher prices for essential services. Africa's infrastructure, painstakingly built after independence, was hollowed out in the name of reform. Then came currency devaluation. To make African exports competitive, IMF programs demanded sharp drops in currency value. The result? Imported goods, from food to medicine, suddenly became unaffordable, while export revenues were captured by foreign buyers paying in cheapened currencies. The ordinary farmer or trader gained nothing. The system was designed to serve outside markets, not local needs. These measures were not accidents. They were designed for control. By ensuring that debts could never be comfortably repaid, the IMF created a cycle where African states had to return, year after year, for new loans. And with every new loan came stricter conditions, harsher reforms, and deeper entanglement. Debt relief became the bait, dependency was the trap. The real genius of the system lay in its invisibility. Unlike colonial troops with rifles, the IMF operated with spreadsheets, contracts, and polite diplomatic language. It was colonization without the spectacle of violence. a system so normalized that many leaders signed willingly, believing there was no alternative. By the 1990s, entire African economies had been reshaped around IMF programs, exporting raw materials, importing manufactured goods, cutting social spending, and keeping servicing debts. The winners were the global financial centers. The losers were African citizens. And yet, for decades, few dared to challenge it openly. Those who resisted, like Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, were swiftly punished, isolated, or worse. The IMF's grip survived not because it was invisible, but because it was considered inevitable. That inevitability has now cracked. Traoré's rejection of the gold collateral deal did more than block a single contract. It pulled the curtain back on the system itself. By calling it an economic coup, he named what millions had long felt but few in power had ever said aloud: that the IMF doesn't save nations, it subordinates them. His words turned whispers into headlines, and headlines into chants on the streets. And here's the turning point. Once the mechanics of exploitation are visible, they lose their legitimacy. Africa is no longer debating whether the IMF's model is flawed. It is debating how to build something beyond it. Which brings us to the final, urgent question. If the old order is cracking and the IMF's game is exposed, what path forward can Africa build that is truly sovereign, sustainable, and free from external control? The collapse of the IMF's illusion leaves Africa standing at a crossroads, but for the first time in generations, it is not a path drawn by outsiders. Across the continent, leaders, institutions, and ordinary citizens are sketching their own blueprint for sovereignty. It does not look like the old aid packages, nor the endless parade of donor conferences. It looks like Africans are taking the pen and writing their own terms. The first pillar of this new path is African financial independence. Institutions like Afreximbank and the African Development Bank are no longer auxiliary players. They are becoming anchors. These banks are not asking for collateral in gold or uranium. They are lending against Africa's potential, with repayment terms shaped by regional priorities. The creation of emergency stabilization funds, capital pools backed by African states themselves, is slowly reducing the desperation that once drove governments to Washington's doorstep. If the IMF has long thrived on being the lender of last resort, Africa is now building its own last resort, on its own soil. The second pillar is intra-African trade. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, is more than a bureaucratic agreement. It is the quiet revolution that could keep African wealth circulating within Africa. For too long, raw materials left African ports cheaply, only to be re-imported as expensive finished goods. AfCFTA's aim is brutally simple: break that cycle. By lowering barriers between African states, the continent can build regional value chains, where Malian cotton feeds Nigerian factories, Burkina gold funds, Ghanaian refineries, and Kenyan innovations power South African markets. The effect is not just economic, it is psychological. It says Africa doesn't need permission slips from Europe or America to trade with itself. The third pillar is monetary autonomy. If the Phoenix dollar represented a new digital leash, African leaders are now exploring digital currencies of their own. Proposals for regional or pan-African e-currencies are not science fiction. They are discussions happening in Addis Ababa, Abuja, and Johannesburg. A digital African currency, backed by the continent's own reserves and managed through continental institutions, would cut the dollar's chokehold on trade and financing. The West once used currencies to colonize, first the franc, then the dollar. The future may see Africa flipping that script, inventing a monetary tool that serves African priorities, not foreign markets. The fourth pillar is industrialization. Resource nationalism means little if gold, oil, and uranium remain exported raw. The new generation of leaders is not just nationalizing. They are building processing plants, refineries, and factories. Burkina Faso's move to expand gold refining capacity is one step. Nigeria's investments in defense industries are another. Mozambique's push into energy infrastructure adds to the momentum. The idea is not isolation, it is transformation. Take what is dug from the soil and multiply its value at home before it ever leaves the continent. And perhaps the most radical pillar of all is unity. The Sahel's military governments, once derided as unstable, are now aligning their policies in a way that terrifies the IMF. Instead of negotiating alone, they are speaking together, whether on mining contracts or currency reform. That spirit of collective defiance is spreading. From the Horn of Africa to Southern Africa, there is a recognition that sovereignty cannot be defended by one nation alone. It requires a continental shield. This is why Traoré's defiance matters so profoundly. By rejecting a single contract, he exposed the entire architecture of dependency, and by doing so, he gave legitimacy to the alternatives Africans have been quietly building. The IMF's power rested on silence. Traoré replaced it with a rallying cry. And here lies the turning point. For the first time in modern history, Africa is not simply resisting Western control, it is designing systems that make that control obsolete. If Afreximbank can eclipse IMF loans, if AFCFTA can anchor trade within the continent, if African currencies can sever dollar dependency, then the IMF is not just weakened, it is irrelevant. What began as a fight over $300 million in gold has revealed itself as something far larger, the death rattle of a financial empire and the birth pangs of an African century. And if history has taught us anything, it is this. Once the fire of sovereignty is lit, it does not flicker out. It spreads. Do you think Africa should ever trust the IMF again after this exposed economic coup? Let us know in the comments section.
It is not late. We have been waiting for this for a long time. It has just arrived, so it is time to put them to the public. Good use.
The West didn't even notice the explosion, not the one from the battlefield, but from Ouagadougou, where Captain Ibrahim Traoré quietly detonated the myth of Western military dominance. While pundits in Paris were still debating African instability, Burkina Faso was unloading Chinese armored beasts and rocket launchers onto its soil, not as aid, not as charity, but as proof that Africa no longer rents its defense. And suddenly, silence. No press briefings, no congratulations, no headlines, because how do you report the end of your own control? Let's get into it. October 10th, 2025 is a date that will haunt Western diplomats for years to come. While global media quietly scrolled past it, Burkina Faso experienced something far larger than a military event. It was a seismic shift in the balance of power on African soil. In the capital, Captain Ibrahim Traoré presided over a handover ceremony that felt less like politics and more like prophecy. The Burkina Faso army officially received a full-scale arsenal of modern armored vehicles, rocket systems, and air defense units, not leased, not donated, but owned. It wasn't just another weapons delivery. It was the moment a nation declared that it would no longer borrow security or outsource survival. The convoy that rolled through Ouagadougou that morning carried more than hardware. It carried a message that rattled every embassy from Paris to Washington. Africa has stopped asking for permission to protect itself. And that's precisely why you didn't see the coverage splashed across Western front pages. They knew what it meant. The illusion of Africa's dependency had been shattered, and the sound of those engines was the sound of their fading relevance. The vehicles gleamed under the Sahel sun. Armored beasts built for endurance, multi-launch rocket systems ready for precision strikes, and tactical support units designed for rough desert combat. But the spectacle wasn't in the steel, it was in the symbolism. Every Burkina Faso watching saw something their grandparents never did. An African army equipped, trained, and commanded by its own people, on its own soil, without the shadow of foreign oversight. Traoré didn't arrive in a limousine flanked by foreign advisors. He stood among his soldiers, barehanded, unguarded, and grounded. He spoke not as a politician addressing troops, but as a soldier speaking to brothers in arms. His words were short, but they landed with the weight of decades. We defend what is ours, and we depend on no one to do it for us. That moment was the quiet explosion the world ignored, the kind that doesn't make noise but rewrites history. Because for the first time in modern West African history, a nation under siege by insurgency was not looking outward for rescue. It was looking inward, building the capacity to fight and win on its own terms. And there was another subtle but powerful detail that foreign observers missed entirely. This wasn't just a handover of arms, it was a transfer of mindset. Burkina Faso is no longer accepting the Western formula of security through supervision. It's building something much more dangerous to the old order, security through sovereignty. But here's the real question. How did a landlocked, resource-constrained nation, constantly vilified by foreign press, manage to achieve what decades of Western partnership failed to deliver? How did it go from being the student in the classroom to the one rewriting the lesson? Burkina Faso's rise didn't happen overnight. What unfolded on October 10th was the product of months spent dismantling a system designed to keep the country obedient. For years, the Burkina Army was a patchwork of second-hand trucks, borrowed radios, and joint operations that required signatures from Western officers before a single patrol could move. The help came wrapped in humiliation. When the guns jammed, spare parts had to be shipped from Europe. When logistics failed, reports had to be filed in English or French before relief arrived. It wasn't a military alliance, it was a leash. Traoré began by cutting that leash quietly. The first target was the illusion of generosity. Every donated rifle carried a hidden cost: policy compliance. So he stopped taking them. The government started redirecting funds once used to host foreign missions into domestic training and local supply chains. The logic was brutally simple. A nation that pays for its own bullets decides when to shoot. Then came the economic judo move that caught analysts off guard. Instead of pleading for more aid, Burkina Faso shifted trade routes and started exchanging gold, cotton, and agricultural products directly with partners in Asia and the Middle East. The revenue didn't vanish into consultancy fees or imported luxuries. It was rerouted into the defense budget. That's how the army could suddenly afford the Norinco VN-22Bs and SR-5 launchers without touching IMF loans. Every transaction was a statement. We can build alliances without mortgages, but equipment alone wasn't enough. Traoré understood that dependency wasn't just financial, it was psychological. Western advisors had convinced African officers that victory depended on international coordination, a polite way of saying, wait for orders. Traoré replaced that mindset with a doctrine of initiative. Officers were told that hesitation kills faster than bullets. Local commanders began planning raids based on ground intelligence instead of foreign satellite data. Within months, insurgent strongholds that had survived for years began collapsing. Not because the weapons were new, but because the permission culture had been destroyed. Foreign capitals didn't take it well. Suddenly, their counterinsurgency partnerships were being rewritten without them. Offers of technical assistance arrived with diplomatic smiles, but everyone knew what they meant: re-entry. Traoré refused. He didn't insult them, he simply made them irrelevant. This is the part most observers miss. Burkina Faso isn't rejecting cooperation, it's redefining it. The deals with China aren't colonial copy-paste, they're transactional, time-bound, and skills-based. The new military hardware came with technology transfer clauses, meaning Burkina technicians are learning to maintain and eventually produce components themselves. Every imported engine is a classroom. Every maintenance hangar is an apprenticeship. By the time the West realized what was happening, the transformation was already irreversible. A country once treated as a client state was now behaving like a sovereign actor. But this shift raises a deeper question. Is Traoré merely building an army, or is he constructing a whole new model of African power that others will follow? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The transition from dependency to defiance was only the foundation. What came next was far more radical, a doctrine, not written in policy papers or whiteboard diagrams, but in the daily routines of soldiers, mechanics, and village patrols. Traoré's new military philosophy isn't about numbers or budgets, it's about psychology. It's about changing what the African soldier believes he is fighting for and who he is fighting under. He started with a brutal question that no Western general had ever dared to ask in Africa. If we die defending our homeland with borrowed weapons, did we really defend it at all? That single thought reshaped the military culture from top to bottom. Officers began training with local languages instead of colonial ones, replacing imported drills with tactics designed for Sahelian terrain. The Burkina army stopped chasing insurgents through deserts like NATO imitations and began fighting as locals defending their homes. The difference was immediate. Soldiers weren't following orders. they were fulfilling a purpose. But the doctrine wasn't just military, it was moral. Traoré saw the army not as an instrument of war, but as the spinal cord of the nation, an institution that binds identity, pride, and production. Barracks turned into learning centers where engineers, welders, and mechanics trained side by side with riflemen. The army began growing its own food, manufacturing its own uniforms, and maintaining its own vehicles. It was no longer a force waiting for supply drops. It was a force that could survive isolation. In Traoré's words, "An army that eats from its own hands fears no embargo." This integration of economics and defense is quietly revolutionary. For the first time, the concept of African sovereignty stopped being an abstract slogan. It became measurable in tons of locally milled grain, in hours of self-run repair work, in every kilometer patrolled without foreign guidance. What the West mistook for militarization was actually civil reorganization. By embedding soldiers in local production chains, Traoré ensured that every weapon used to defend Burkina Faso also defended its economy. Meanwhile, a new generation of commanders was emerging, men and women raised not in foreign academies, but in Burkinabe soil, fluent in both strategy and local struggle. They're not just soldiers, they're the intellectual heirs of a doctrine that rejects the imported fear of failure. To them, losing territory is temporary. Losing independence is eternal. What unnerved foreign observers most wasn't the firepower, it was the faith. A faith that Africa's defense doesn't need permission, validation, or supervision. Traoré turned patriotism into training and loyalty into logistics. He built an army that fights for something no external military could ever supply: self-respect. And this, inevitably, provoked a reaction. Because the stronger Burkina Faso's doctrine grew stronger, the weaker Western influence became. Their diplomats began to whisper about regional destabilization, as if African unity were somehow a threat. But perhaps that's the most revealing part. When African nations finally defend themselves, it's called escalation, which leads us directly to the next question. If Burkina Faso's self-reliant model is spreading across the Sahel, what does this mean for the old powers who once claimed to guarantee Africa's security? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. By the time Burkina Faso's self-reliant doctrine took form, Western policymakers were already scrambling for explanations. They couldn't understand how a country once dismissed as fragile was suddenly projecting confidence, competence, and control. The silence from Western capitals wasn't confusion, it was disbelief. Because for decades their entire relationship with Africa had rested on one unspoken principle: we protect, you obey. Now that model is collapsing. Traoré has not only defied the system, he has exposed its absurdity. The West's military presence across Africa, from drone bases in Niger to counterinsurgency outposts in Chad, was sold as partnership, but it operated like insurance. As long as African states depended on their protection, they could dictate policies, control trade routes, and extract resources under the banner of security cooperation. But with Burkina Faso's new independence, that insurance policy is expiring. When the Burkinabe government stopped taking Western assistance packages, the first thing that vanished wasn't funding, it was interference. No more joint committees to approve operations, no more external vetoes disguised as strategic coordination. For Western defense officials, this wasn't just a diplomatic loss, it was an existential one. They weren't losing influence over one nation, they were losing the illusion that Africa needed them at all. In private briefings, analysts now describe the Sahel as slipping out of alignment. That's a euphemism for losing control. The United States sees its drone operations shrinking. France, already humiliated by expulsions from Mali and Niger, is watching its remaining bases in West Africa turn into symbolic relics, unwanted reminders of an era that Africans are rapidly burying. Every armored truck that rolls out of Ouagadougou without a foreign flag attached is a blow to Western pride. And yet, the panic isn't just about military access, it's about narrative control. For years, Western media framed African security crises as ungovernable regions, justifying intervention as a moral duty. But now, With the rise of local command structures and regional alliances like the Alliance of Sahel States (AES), that storyline no longer holds. If Africans can secure their borders and defend their people without NATO or the UN, then what exactly is the West's role? The answer, increasingly, is none. But rather than admit it, they're rebranding the loss. Western analysts now warn about authoritarian consolidation in the Sahel, the latest term for what used to be called sovereignty. When Africans make decisions for themselves, it's tyranny. When foreigners make them, it's partnership. That double standard is the final refuge of a fading empire. The irony is painful. The same powers that spent decades preaching democracy are now condemning Africans for practicing independence. Traoré's government hasn't banned cooperation. It's just redefined it. He's proven that mutual respect doesn't need permission slips, and that national pride can't be outsourced. But this transformation isn't just political theater. It's producing ripple effects far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. The doctrine of self-defense is catching fire across the Sahel. And soon the question won't be how the West reacts. It'll be whether Africa itself is ready to handle the new power it has just reclaimed. The panic in Western circles is understandable because what began in Burkina Faso is no longer confined to its borders. The idea has traveled quietly at first, then with the momentum of inevitability. The Burkina Faso model has turned into a symbol of what every African nation secretly craves but rarely dares to attempt: self-determination without apology. From Bamako to Niamey, leaders are studying Traoré's doctrine not as an experiment, but as a template. Mali has begun retooling its armed forces with local command autonomy, reducing reliance on European training missions. Niger, after years of housing foreign drones, is now negotiating on its own terms, no longer a staging ground but a stakeholder. Even beyond the Sahel, the echoes are spreading, across West Africa, East Africa, and the Horn, where governments are asking the same forbidden question. If Burkina Faso can stand without Western security umbrellas, why can't we? What's unfolding isn't military escalation. It's mental emancipation. For the first time in a generation, Africans are recognizing that strength doesn't come from imported stability, but from internal coordination. Traoré's vision has become less about weapons and more about willpower. He's proven that when a leader replaces dependency with discipline, a small nation can shake global hierarchies, and the transformation is practical, not poetic. Burkina Faso's defense restructuring has already begun to influence its economy and diplomacy. Local industries are supplying parts for military maintenance, creating jobs and new skills. Border communities once abandoned to bandits are now trading safely again. Even the tone of Burkina Faso diplomacy has changed, firmer, bolder, and unembarrassed. The country no longer attends summits to plead, it attends to negotiate. That shift in posture has altered Africa's wider geopolitical balance. When the Alliance of Sahel States (AES) announced deeper integration in intelligence, logistics, and resource protection, it wasn't just a regional bloc forming. It was a signal to the world that Africa is finished playing the role of the client continent, and the West knows it. Every successful convoy, every secured province, every new industrial partnership outside the Western sphere reinforces a truth they've long tried to bury. Africa doesn't need rescue missions, it needs respect. But the most remarkable part of this story isn't what Traoré achieved, it's how he reframed the very definition of African leadership. He's not promising endless stability, he's promising ownership of chaos. He understands that freedom is messy, and that sovereignty without struggle is a myth. That's why his approach resonates. It treats Africans as adults in history, not subjects of it. Now, as other nations begin their own transformations, the continent stands at a crossroads, between the ghosts of dependency and the dawn of dignity. The West can either adapt to an Africa that negotiates eye to eye, or retreat into nostalgia for a world that no longer exists. Because the age of permission politics is over. The next chapter of African power will not be written in Washington, Paris, or London. It's already being written in the dust of Ouagadougou, by hands that finally hold the pen instead of waiting for it to be handed to them. If one small nation like Burkina Faso can break the chains of dependency, what excuse do the larger ones have for still kneeling? Let us know in the comments section. Something unusual is unfolding inside Burkina Faso's corridors of power. Captain Ibrahim Traoré isn't surrounded by ordinary guards. He's encircled by silence, precision, and unflinching loyalty. A masked sentinel shadows his every step. A man they call Gaddafi commands the strike response. Another, known only as Number 3, listens, observes, and eliminates threats before they breathe. This isn't a security detail. It's a philosophy of survival, born in a land where betrayal travels faster than bullets. And today, we ask, who protects the protector? And what are they really guarding? Let's find out. They don't wear uniforms. They don't salute. They don't smile. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré walks into a room, they're already there, unseen, yet felt, like the shift in air before a storm. One stands slightly behind him, a masked sentinel whose eyes never blink during public appearances. Another lingers at the edge of every corridor, hand resting near his weapon but never touching it. And somewhere, always nearby but never in sight, is the man they call Number 3, the brain of the operation, listening, analyzing, memorizing faces and exits as if mapping danger itself. This is the core of Traoré's personal guard, the most secretive security unit in West Africa. A team so disciplined it has become myth even among soldiers. They are not part of the conventional presidential guard. They belong only to the revolution that brought Traoré to power, forged in the belief that loyalty must be proven by endurance, not rank. Their world runs on precision. Every route Traoré takes is tested twice, once by intelligence, once by instinct. Each building he enters is stripped of unpredictability, lights, windows, angles, and even the reflection on polished marble. Their presence is an equation, solved to ensure one result: the captain must walk out alive. It's easy to dismiss them as just another layer of security. But spend 5 minutes observing them, and you realize they are something else entirely. Men who've learned to see what others ignore. When the captain speaks publicly, one watches the horizon, another watches the crowd, and a third watches the silence between claps. They aren't waiting for a shot. They're reading behavior, the micro-movements of nerves and hesitation. In the Sahel, danger doesn't always arrive with a gun. Sometimes it's a phone call. Sometimes it's an ally who turns too quiet. Their formation tells a story of how Traoré understands power, not as a symbol of dominance, but as a fragile flame in a windstorm. He knows the weight of history, that Sankara was betrayed by a friend, that Gaddafi's guard broke ranks, that every African reformer who stood tall eventually fell not to invaders, but to those closest to them. That memory has shaped every detail of this unit's design. These men were chosen through field loyalty, not ceremony. Each served with Traoré in the Sahelian front lines, men who survived ambushes, hunger, heat, and fatigue. They've seen him fight, not command. That's why their allegiance is personal. It's not to the office of the president, it's to the man who stood beside them in trenches when bullets didn't care about titles. Even their silence has a hierarchy. The masked man represents proximity. He never leaves the captain's side. Gaddafi embodies reaction, the one who moves when everything else stops. Number 3 orchestrates the invisible, the strategist whose radio rarely speaks, because communication itself is risky. Together they operate like a closed circuit. One senses, one acts, one decides. They train in isolation, live fire drills in the desert, night infiltration undercover, and drones and intelligence exercises based on real coup scenarios. No footage exists of their sessions, no soldier outside the circle joins them. They've built their reputation not by bragging, but by what never happens. The coups that never succeed, the ambushes that never occur, the bullets that never find their target. To outsiders, they seem ruthless. To Traoré, they are a necessity. Because in a region where loyalty is transactional, he needed men who would rather die than hesitate. That is what separates them from all others. They don't protect his position, they protect his mission. And as Burkina Faso rebuilds itself amid threats, sanctions, and wars of influence, these men remain invisible architects of stability. You may never hear their voices, but every time Traoré steps into a crowd without fear, you're witnessing their work. But how did such loyalty become possible in a world where power usually corrupts it? Loyalty isn't born, it's engineered. And in Burkina Faso's new order, it was engineered in fire. To understand the men who guard Captain Ibrahim Traoré, you first need to understand the philosophy that forged them. Because this unit wasn't just created to protect a man, it was designed to protect an idea, that Africa can secure itself without asking permission. When Traoré took power in 2022, The world expected another military strongman. Instead, they got a soldier who refused to behave like one. He wasn't building palaces or parades, he was building trust. But in a country where betrayal had already rewritten history too many times, trust couldn't be given. It had to be tested. That's when he began selecting men, not from generals or decorated elites, but from the forgotten corners of the Sahel. Soldiers who had tasted hunger, fought with outdated weapons, and still didn't break. These were men who didn't follow orders because they feared punishment. They followed because they believed in a purpose. One of them was a sniper from the north, once wounded and left for dead, rescued by Traoré himself. Another was a comms officer who discovered a French-funded intelligence leak and refused a bribe to stay quiet. Each man brought a story of endurance, proof that loyalty wasn't emotion, it was evidence. Traoré's rulebook for recruitment was simple. You don't guard the leader until you understand what he stands for. Every candidate was questioned not about tactics, but about motives. What would you protect first? He reportedly asked. My life or my mission? Those who answered your life were dismissed immediately. Because this isn't a team of defenders, it's a circle of believers. Their loyalty is ideological, not hierarchical. They see Traoré not as a ruler, but as a symbol of the generation reclaiming Africa's agency, a soldier who turned defiance into policy. That's what makes them dangerous, because a man defending his salary hesitates, a man defending meaning doesn't. This mindset explains their intensity. They don't joke in public, they rarely speak. They train longer than the National Guard and live apart from the rest of the army, in a compound that even government ministers can't access. The rule is absolute. No media, no pictures, no contact with outsiders. Visibility kills, one of them reportedly said. But behind that secrecy lies something more sophisticated than muscle, psychological conditioning. Each member undergoes intelligence resilience training, how to detect manipulation, how to spot deception in speech, how to resist coercion if captured. They're taught to see danger not as an event but as a pattern, subtle changes in tone, timing, or body language that reveal intent long before an attack ever happens. Traoré knows that coups don't begin with bullets, they begin with whispers. A rumor spreads, an officer delays an order, a convoy suddenly changes route. By the time blood is shed, the betrayal has already matured. His guards are trained to catch the disease in its incubation. This approach has quietly reshaped Burkina Faso's internal security philosophy, where Western governments build security through hardware, drones, surveillance systems, and expensive software. Traoré builds it through human discipline. He understands something most analysts miss. In Africa, stability isn't technological, it's personal. People betray systems, not bonds. That's why these men are not interchangeable. Each one is irreplaceable because each one carries a layer of Traoré's strategy embedded in his psyche. They aren't just trained to react, they're trained to anticipate him, to understand how he moves, thinks, and decides. In other words, they don't just protect his body, they extend his instincts. And that's what makes this circle nearly unbreakable. It's not a wall, it's an echo. Every move he makes resonates through them. Every danger they sense, he already knows. Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. To understand this unit, you can't just watch what they do, you have to understand how they think. Their world runs on a single principle. Threats are not fought, they are predicted. From the outside, it looks almost mystical how Traoré's team manages to stop plots before they unfold, intercept attacks before they start, and dissolve conspiracies before they gather courage. But the truth isn't magic. It's a method, a system built on anticipation and silence. Every day begins the same way. Before dawn, the team reviews what they call the horizon file. It's not about the next 24 hours, it's about the next 72. They map movements, conversations, financial transfers, and even moods within the army. Patterns are everything. If a commander visits the same cafe twice in a week, they notice. If a foreign contact suddenly cancels a trip, they ask why. Their logic is simple. Coup plots don't start in bunkers, they start in routine. The masked man, Traoré's ever-present sentinel, leads proximity analysis. His job isn't just to stand guard, it's to read energy. When Traoré meets ministers, he watches reactions, body posture, and breathing rhythms. He's trained to detect dishonesty from micro-expressions, the kind of training you'd find in intelligence agencies, not military ranks. For him, a tremor of the hand means more than a speech. Gaddafi, the fighter, controls the response. He drills his sub-team in close-quarters tactics adapted to African terrain, not Western urban combat, but dust, heat, and unpredictability. His men can switch from escort to engagement in seconds, blending old-school guerrilla tactics with modern coordination. They don't wait for orders. They act from instinct polished by routine. And then there's number 3, the quiet strategist, the invisible thread holding everything together. He doesn't lead soldiers, he leads information. Each intercepted signal, rumor, or shift in loyalty passes through him. He ranks threats not by scale, but by potential impact on morale. Because Traoré's greatest weapon isn't firepower, it's unity. A fractured army can fall faster than an ambushed one. What makes this doctrine revolutionary is its fusion of intelligence, psychology, and symbolism. In the Sahel, wars aren't just fought with bullets, they're fought with narratives. The West calls these men loyalists, but within Burkina Faso, they are seen as disciples of sovereignty. Their silence is deliberate, a message that power doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs to be present, unseen, unshaken. Their operations extend beyond defense. When Traoré travels, they arrive days in advance, embedding within local security teams, identifying weak links. They run what insiders call mirror drills, simulated coup rehearsals against themselves, stress testing their own system. If any reaction time exceeds 5 seconds, the plan is rewritten. But behind their efficiency lies a moral question Traoré himself seems aware of. How much control is too much? Because absolute loyalty creates absolute dependence. The guards decide who gets close, who stays away, and even which ministers' vehicles can approach the convoy. In many ways, they don't just protect the presidency, they define its perimeter of trust, and yet this structure works. It's why the captain walks into hostile regions without fear. Why, despite constant Western media predictions of instability, does his government stand firm? The invisible doctrine isn't about strength, it's about stability through anticipation. Still, this kind of precision has consequences. The tighter the system, the more isolated it becomes. And isolation, if unchecked, can blur the line between vigilance and paranoia. So the next question isn't how the guards function. We've seen that. It's what happens when their silence becomes the loudest voice in Burkina Faso's leadership. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Every great system eventually faces the same question. When does protection stop being protection and start becoming control? Within Burkina Faso's inner circle, that question isn't theoretical. It defines the line between survival and suffocation. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's guards were built to shield him from betrayal, but the stronger that shield becomes, the more it isolates him from the world beyond it. What began as a fortress against enemies is slowly becoming a filter through which all information, emotion, and access must pass. This paradox is familiar to every revolution that survives long enough to consolidate. Power attracts loyalty, but loyalty, when absolute, reshapes power itself. Traoré's guards have mastered efficiency to such an extent that even his closest allies now measure their words carefully around him. Not out of fear of him, but fear of being misread by those who protect him. The guards' silence carries more weight than any minister's speech. Their dominance in the chain of trust has unintended consequences. For instance, they decide which reports reach Traoré first, which faces enter his meetings, and which voices are safe. It's not censorship, it's prioritization. But in the volatile theater of Sahel politics, prioritization is power. Whoever controls proximity controls perception, and whoever controls perception controls reality. Yet, what makes this situation different from other African regimes is that Traoré seems aware of the danger. Insiders describe him as cautious but not paranoid. He still meets soldiers, visits provinces, and speaks directly to civilians. But you can sense the tension in every frame of footage, the invisible choreography between his confidence and the alertness of the men around him. Every handshake is timed, every smile scanned. Still, this structure serves its purpose. Burkina Faso has avoided the instability that tore its neighbors apart. The intelligence leaks have stopped. The coup chatter that once echoed through barracks now dies before it leaves a room. Traoré's leadership has become a case study in how security, when properly humanized, can act as both armor and compass. But that balance is fragile. If his guards ever misinterpret caution for disloyalty or loyalty for weakness, the entire philosophy could collapse under its own vigilance. The very men who keep the revolution alive could, unintentionally, suffocate it. That's the tragic rhythm of protection. The closer it clings to the flame, the greater its risk of snuffing it out. But perhaps that's the price of reshaping a nation in real time. Traoré's defenders are not relics of a paranoid state. They're products of a new African realism. They operate on the understanding that sovereignty doesn't just need visionaries. It needs guardians willing to bear the moral weight of what protection demands. And so, Burkina Faso stands at a crossroads. The guards have become both symbols and safeguards, proof that independence can be defended from within, but also a reminder that trust, once monopolized, can become tyranny in disguise. The question now isn't whether Traoré can stay alive. He's done that. The question is whether he can stay connected to the people, to the truth, and to the revolution that gave him purpose. Because in the end, every wall built to protect power eventually asks its builder the same thing: will you live behind it, or die because of it? Every revolution, sooner or later, outgrows its guns. It reaches a point where the question is no longer who protects the leader, but what the leader's protection has come to represent. That's where Captain Ibrahim Traoré stands now. Not just as a man shielded by loyal guards, but as the symbol of a continent learning how to guard its own sovereignty. Because this story was never really about the men with masks and rifles. It's about what their existence says about the world around them. In the Sahel, power doesn't just face enemies, it faces infiltration. Every foreign handshake carries intent, every intelligence leak carries influence. For decades, African leaders were protected by others: the French Foreign Legion, UN contingents, or private firms hired from abroad. Their safety came at the cost of sovereignty. Traoré flipped that logic. He built protection from within, African hands guarding African decisions. That's what makes his bodyguard unit more than a security detail. They are a statement, a reminder that Africa no longer needs guardians who speak another language. And yet, this choice comes with a heavy moral weight. The moment protection becomes symbolic, it stops being invisible. These men have become both shield and spotlight. Every action they take reflects the credibility of Traoré's revolution. If they overstep, the West calls it repression. If they falter, the same critics call it incompetence. They walk the razor's edge between necessity and optics, between defending a cause and defining it. Still, there's something undeniably transformative in what they've achieved. Burkina Faso, once mocked as a coup-prone state, now radiates discipline. The streets of Ouagadougou move with a kind of uneasy calm, not the calm of fear, but the calm that follows regained control. It's the calm of a nation no longer asking permission to breathe. But this calm also comes with silence, and silence can be deceptive. Because even the most loyal guard can't protect an idea forever. Guns can secure a moment, they can't secure a legacy. What keeps nations alive isn't fear of failure, but continuity of conviction. Traoré's challenge now is to translate loyalty into institutions, to ensure that the discipline of his guards becomes the discipline of a government. In that sense, the presidential shield is a bridge between eras, between the instability that defined Africa's past and the sovereignty that could define its future. Their existence forces a deeper question upon every leader across the continent. Can you truly call yourself independent if someone else ensures your safety? For Traoré, the answer has already been given, in the silence of those who stand behind him, watchful and unblinking. But history will judge whether that silence becomes the foundation of a new order or the echo of another cycle. Because revolutions are not measured by how they begin, they're measured by what survives them. Can a revolution truly stay pure when its survival depends on secrecy? Let us know in the comments section. Are these men guarding a leader, or guarding an idea that threatens the old world order? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.